No mai haere mai. I'm Tim Wilson, and recently I was fortunate enough to moderate Maxim Institute's conversation night on COVID debt. Now, as you'll probably quickly appreciate, this is not the normal sound quality for a podcast. It was recorded live. The quality of what's being said, that's what I urge you to pay attention to. We've got no apologies for that. Without any further ado, let's get started.
COVID has changed everything. Governments around the world have turned on the money pump, often throwing every fiscal tool they have at the COVID-19 shock. Borrowing money, printing money, lowering interest rates. The spectacle has been quite remarkable. Who would have believed that New Zealand house prices would go so high so quickly, hitting an average price of $780,000 on the most recent review? House stock value increased by $200 billion in the year of COVID. Now, to put that in context, our GDP is $322 billion. Who would have believed that luxury cars would be selling so plentifully? That spa pools in New Zealand would have one of their best years ever, with one Nelson company growing by 400% in a year. Yet the spectre of debt looms. Our government debt in New Zealand is now $103 billion, or 32% of GDP. By 2025, it's expected to be around $190 billion, just under half of our GDP. And we're one of the good ones. The global debt to GDP ratio is currently 355%. That's gone up by 35 percentage points in a year, this year of COVID. By comparison, the GFC added 10 percentage points to the global debt mountain. So the world indebtedness levels are 355% of GDP. Should we be alarmed? Should we be buying houses? Should we be buying guns? Probably not, but we're here to answer those questions. We want to understand this better. We want to get behind the numbers to see what the numbers mean. How much debt do we have really? What might a recovery look like? And might it also look a bit like a crash? We'll get into that. And how is this debt mountain reshaping our society? Joining me to unpack these and other questions are Lyndon Drake and Julian Wood, and I'll introduce them for you. The Venerable Dr. Lyndon Drake is of Ngāi Tahu descent, and he serves as Archdeacon of Tamaki Makaurau in the Māori Anglican Bishopric of Te Tai Tokerau. He's married to Miriam, who is here, and they have 3 children. Until 2010, Lyndon was a vice president at Barclays Capital, trading government bonds and interest rate derivatives. Lyndon has degrees in science and commerce, a PhD in computer science, 2 degrees in theology, and a number of peer-reviewed academic publications in science and theology. He's the author of Capital Markets for the Common Good, A Christian Perspective. Put your hands together, please, for Lyndon. And Julian Wood is senior researcher at Maxim Institute, primarily a labour economist with a master's in social science and a history of strategic labour market policy work. He's done work in areas like minimum wages, migration and regional development. He's married to Alice and they have a lovely son, Theo. Julian's worked at the Department of Labour and also operated a farm in rural China. He's produced a wide range of research for Maxim Institute covering regional development, migration, and active labour market policies. He's currently examining modern forms of work, particularly in this era, and how these increasingly non-standard digital platform, we're talking Uber here, precarious work practices, interface with the tax and welfare support systems. Put your hands together, please, for Julian. 355% of world GDP, that's the debt level. Lyndon, are you alarmed?
Well, it depends a little bit on how you want to break that up. And in one sense, of course, this seems like an extraordinary amount of money, but it does depend a little bit on the form of the debt, and it also depends in the end on what that debt is spent on. Now, I was a trader, not an economist, and before I was needling my friend here and saying that traders are economists whose jobs rely on predicting the future correctly.
And that's the first burn of the evening, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm so happy to be able to get that in. It's all downhill from here for me. And I will defer to my much more expert friend on the exact breakdown here, but there's something significant when debt becomes unmanageable, but it really does depend to a great degree on who that debt has come from. So, for example, if I were to personally owe 355% of world GDP, this would clearly be problematic. And I haven't run up debts of that magnitude. But there's also the possibility that if you're the government and you can create more of the money with which the debt will be repaid and can also compel people to repay the debt through taxation, there's an argument that perhaps that's not such a worrying situation to be in. There are some complexities to that, though, and I'm sure Julian would like to break it down further.
Somebody said, I need that money tomorrow. The world would be in big, big, big trouble. Like, that's the reality of the debt situation at the moment. But that's not what is going to happen. And then you compare that to New Zealand, where you've already said it was 32% or 33% of GDP at the moment. I think it's 37% is core crown debt by the end of the year. I mean, that sounds like just an order of magnitude smaller, and it is. But I think the thing that we've fooled ourselves in New Zealand is that, oh, we're great because we're at 37%, or by 2025 we're only going to be at 47% or 48%. I think you need to look at debt in a different way, and you need to look at public debt and private debt together as a debt envelope. And I think that's where New Zealand starts to get a little bit more on shaky ground, and that's simply because the government's not the problem in New Zealand. The core crown government debt is not the problem in New Zealand. It's lauded the world over as being fantastic. We just got a AAA or AA rating because of it. The problem is private debt. So in the New Zealand situation, that's where we need to start our little sort of radars going, beep, 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 there might be a problem here. So should we be worried? Potentially. And it might not actually, debt might not be the thing that causes the big problem. I think there's, the way that debt's been created, I think is going to have some secondary impacts. And I think inflation is one of those.
We're going to get to that a bit later. But what is driving this private debt in New Zealand, Julian?
Oh, it's access to cheap money, right? So, and it's not just cheap money from New Zealand, it's cheap money from the world over. So, I just think it's access to cheap money. And interest rates falling. So I think since the 1990s, the world over, in lots of places, the way we have controlled the economy is through the official cash rate or, adjusting the interest rate. And so that's meant as the economy has struggled over time, we've continually lowered interest rates as a way of combating that. They haven't bounced back. And so there's this idea of sort of secular stagnation, which is eventually you get to a point where interest rates just can't come back up, and you get stagnation and low interest rates combining. So,
because you believe, Lyndon, that we're in a low interest rate environment that will persist for quite a while.
Yeah, and that's a view I've held for quite a while. So coming out of the financial crisis, which I was trading through, so I was quite professionally involved in interest rates at the time.
This is the GFC.
That's right,
global
yeah,
financial
the GFC.
Crisis.
In England, it's called the financial crisis. New Zealand, it's called the GFC, and I always forget. I'm now out of place in my own country. Coming out of that, I formed the opinion, not by myself, and certainly not alone, that we were in the developed world, we were heading into a very long-term cycle of low interest rates. So previously, there'd often been cycles where nominal rates or policy rates had dropped, though never quite this low, for a long period of time. And my view was that we were facing a situation really that's quite similar to what happened in Japan off the back of the 80s, early 90s. Now, some of the mechanics of that are different. There are some quite important differences, but there are also some similarities. And so I've got no idea how long that will continue for, but certainly I think for the foreseeable future at the moment, my view would be we're still looking at low policy rates.
And this is maybe a little point of disagreement. I think there could, well, definitely, I mean, absolutely there is asset price inflation right now. So the reason we've got high house prices is simply inflation. It's just not the one that the Reserve Bank's looking at. So CPI, consumer price inflation, still dead as a doornail, going nowhere for the foreseeable future. But there is inflation everywhere. There's asset price inflation. People are paying $69 million for a GIF that is in a frame on a wall. Sneakers are outrageously priced. Gold's going off its chops. I mean, I just think, so what you are seeing is inflation. Yes. It's just not the one that we're looking at to measure. So in some respects, I think inflation is already here. It's just that CPI measurement is not going anywhere, which is interesting because, like, why has that split happened?
That seems quite unbalanced in a way, in that it's going to places that we're not measuring. So are we going to be able to assess the effect then?
I mean, yeah, everybody's worried about it, right? This is actually probably the key moment, really, is you see all the pressure coming on the government. We need to solve the housing crisis. Why are we paying $1.7 million for the average house in certain parts of Auckland? And, you know, why are we paying nearly $1 million in Dunedin for it? You know, so there's a heap of political pressure right now, and it's all fueled around this inflation, house price inflation. So in some respects, it's there, and they're fighting, they're grappling with. So the government literally just gave the Reserve Bank the mandate to look at house prices as well. You know, and that's a significant shift in policy in New Zealand. Right, going right back to the sort of the emergence of the Public Finance Act in the 1990s, 89 I think it was. So yeah, you're seeing some big policy shifts right now and some big question marks. I do think the whole modern frame of economics, monetarist economics, there's a big question mark right now. Is this the best way to manage the economy?
And I think this goes back to the point you made before, which is it's not even just about the quantification of debt, but the enormous other changes that are feeding into the economy right now. And some of those are policy changes where what's become the way of managing, for example, unemployment effectively through monetary policy and other aspects of the economy, this has become the orthodoxy. New Zealand led the way in this, but it's the way the West is more or less run. And what we're seeing now is there's a real complexity in the economic effects, the social effects, the structural effects of the shock that we've experienced at COVID-19 that make it very difficult to predict even the policy environment that's about to eventuate. But that policy environment feeds very directly into the outcomes for these different kinds of debt and for the knock-on social impacts for that. And so we do see markets pricing in, the bond market. I used to love watching bond prices shift in ways that reflected before equity markets did that there was a problem. And you see, Julian mentioned this the other day, that bond markets have been selling off, government bond markets, indicating that there is a real expectation here of interest rates rising in the future. And
so you've seen them spike up to what, 1.7%,
for the US 10-year,
something like that, yeah. That's really interesting because then you get into the and there's a fantastic bun fight between two really well-known economists in America, Larry Summers and Stiglitz, I think it is, or I think it's Stiglitz. I'm not sure, but
is one of them, yeah.
But basically arguing over what's going to happen if interest rates start to go up.
I think that's a discussion as well about what the recovery looks like, and we will get to that. I just want to return to something you said, Lyndon, in the way that you said New Zealand treated issues like unemployment with monetary policy. Can you explain how we did that?
So traditionally, and again, Julian may well speak to more of the detail on this, but traditionally monetary policy, and in particular the policy rate set by the central bank, that then feeds on out into all other aspects of the economy. So eventually, for those who are homeowners, into the rates you pay for mortgage loans. That may well have been set for political reasons. And there are a number of people here in the room who remember things around the currency crises that tended to be a feature of that kind of setup as well, because it became very difficult sometimes to separate the different needs. So the prevailing orthodoxy now is that central bank independence in setting that policy rate is a very important aspect of managing the economy. And on the whole, that seems to have worked really quite well in certain respects.
So, if you go back before monetary, sort of this rise of monetarist economics, there was quite active labour market policies. The government would intervene, it would mop up unemployment. You saw, the post office and the railways having 20,000 people, and there were, a lot of inefficiencies in that system. But the primary way of dealing with unemployment was for the government to assist in creating a job somewhere. Yeah, and then sort of through the reform period, all of that shifted, and we said, no, we can't trust the government with that. They're very inefficient, and we saw that in New Zealand. You saw the railways managing parcels of land that they didn't actually own. So literally organising for pieces to be mowed. They had no ownership rights over that land. So there are heaps of inefficiencies. And where we got to was, hey, we can't trust politicians with this. What we can do is we can say to the Reserve Bank, if the economy's getting too strong, inflation's going up, because you saw horrible stagflation of the 70s where unemployment and inflation was going up. What we should do is just, stop that. And the way we stop it is to increase interest rates. So you can slow down the economy by increasing interest rates, because it's just going to cost more money to run the economy with higher interest rates. And if you want to speed up the economy, you just lower the interest rate. And if you lower the interest rate, people will borrow more, firms will borrow more, and you'll start this. And so you mop up unemployment basically by letting the private market do it.
When the government gets loaned money, how does it get paid back? If my wife's Dutch, so if she loans me money, I have to pay it back. How does sorry, darling. And so when the government, let's just stick to the knitting. When the government borrows money, how does it pay it back?
Well, this is a subject that was dear to my heart because I spent most of the Gordon Brown years in the UK listening to him announce his budgets along with in his very sort of dour tones, no more boom and bust, which shortly after he became Prime Minister, turned out there was quite a big bust, which most of you can recall. And of course, when he came to issue the debt, he would ring up me and other people, not personally, I never spoke to the guy on the phone. He had an office to do this kind of thing. And they would run an auction in which we and the banks would lend the money to the government, and then we'd try and flog it off to other people. And I've brought with me a particular example of this. This is war loan. The British government has a policy, this was from the 1960s actually, which is a bit puzzling. Normally during wars, they take a very patriotic approach to being repaid on their debt. And they encourage their citizens to lend them money with no repayment date. And so I was still trading bonds that had been issued to finance the war against Napoleon, for example. Though they did, a couple of years back, finally pay that debt off, not because of any repayment reason, but there are certain technical reasons around the pricing that had made it very annoying to have in the market. So, strictly speaking, the government doesn't necessarily, I'm going to pass this round, the government doesn't necessarily feel super obliged to pay it back. And of course, numerous governments have in fact decided not to at various points. And I remember a colleague at Barclays who got very caught out at one stage by deciding that sovereign states never default on their debt. And this is complete ignorance of history. Sovereign states really quite frequently default on their debt and don't pay it back. In fact, there was a debate, and I'm sorry for having a go at people from the Netherlands, but I'm going to anyway.
It's open season at the moment, isn't it?
One of my colleagues from the Netherlands, when there was a bit of a crisis going on around Greek and Italian debt, because of course they don't have their own currency, it's much harder to, to do things around debt repayment when you don't have control of the currency. Even worse, by the way, if you can't tax people in the currency your debts are nominated in. Anyway, he said, well, they must be compelled to pay it back. And I said, well, how are you going to compel the Greeks to repay the debt? They're a sovereign country. And he said, well, but there will just be a war. And I said, but that's not a very good social outcome. And he said, no, but we will win. And I thought, okay, I don't think his argument was like the Greek army is just as bad as the Greek railway, and therefore I thought, we're not approaching this from the same frame of reference. But there is an argument, in the end, for most governments, for the New Zealand government, hey, we can just print money. And
we can print money. Yep. So I mean, there are risks, right? So yes, you can roll over debt, you can reissue more bonds. just roll it over, and you could create a bond that had a 100-year payback, that eventually, or like say 200 years,
Perpetual.
Perpetual. You can sell products that don't need to be paid back, but I mean, generally speaking, you don't get very far in life by not paying your debts. Like eventually, someone comes knocking, and it's the repo man. The IMF might turn up on your doorstep and say, well, we're now going to change your social policy, we're going to get rid of your public infrastructure. Actually, that whole socialised healthcare that you guys have, we might just get rid of that and privatise it. So you open the door to foreign influence, to foreign policy making, maybe to a war. So there are reasons why you do pay back debt, and there's a reason why you don't let debt get out of control, and there's a reason why you generally try and meet your commitments. And part of that is interest rates. If our international rating goes from a AA to a B, interest rates will go up. Everybody will have to pay higher mortgage rates. You'll see mortgage rates, you'll see people defaulting on their loans probably because of the over-leverage that we are in New Zealand and the high house prices. So there'll be blood on the floor, basically. So there is a reason, yes, technically, the Reserve Bank at the moment has got lots and lots and lots of government bonds, and all they did was put some digital zeros into the Treasury, and then the Treasury is spending those digital zeros and ones. They could just hold on to that money. They could just hold on to those bonds and say, you know what, in 100 years' time, thank you very much. We'll just let those slide away into nowhere land. Like, that's possible, and that's only possible if that's New Zealand currency debt in New Zealand held by a government institution. If that debt gets on-sold, it's highly unlikely that will ever happen. So I mean,
Technically you can, but it's not a highly desirable strategy.
No. Partly because of what the line of work I used to be in as a bond trader, known as the bond vigilantes, because the people who go and force the sell-off tended to be people like me. And so we were seen as both part of the process of issuing it, but also part of the problem once there was a perception that it had become too risky.
Yeah. I mean, and the risks are great. And so hence Public Finance Act, hence a whole section there that says prudence, reasonable levels of debt, try and get down to zero debt, or not zero debt, but, and so we have this social contract in New Zealand basically that says 30%. Prudent fiscal debt in New Zealand for a long time was 30% of GDP. Yeah, that's kind of made up.
That's changed.
That's kind of made up, right?
Yeah.
Public perception.
One way, though, to get out of debt is to have an economic recovery, and the IMF is forecasting some sort of bounce back over the next year. But there's lots of talk I hear about a K-shaped recovery. Can you explain that to me, Julian?
Well, at one level, I just don't like the word at all, and so I'll say K-shaped recovery doesn't exist, and then at the same time I'll say, but it does exist entirely. So all it means is there's winners and losers. The sad thing is that there's always been winners and losers. It's just that the nature and the structure of the current crisis has exasperated some of those issues along structural lines. So you see tourism sector being massively hit, yeah? And who works in tourism jobs? What types of jobs are they? Often they're women, often they're low paid, low skill jobs, and they've just taken a massive hit. So COVID hasn't walked up to women and say, oh, I'm going to pick you and hurt you. It hasn't walked up to tourism and said, I pick you as a sector. It's just the nature of the structural side of it. But there's winners. I mean, some sectors of New Zealand have been going absolutely gangbusters. Best profit levels ever, more spa pools sold than ever before.
Spa pools for Africa.
Yep, and often they're luxury goods. Did you notice that? Yep. So, probably there's been more luxury cars sold recently than family sedans. I don't know. But there is this, it's entrenching those winners and losers. And often it's about wealth, not income. And so this is another side to it that I don't think has been explained very well. But for example, what do you make of a tourist operator that's been operating in tourism for a few years that actually has got 3 houses, 2 of which they rent? Their asset wealth has gone massively up. Their tourism business has probably gone down. is that K-shaped or is that just something else? So there's a side to this which is, it's not as simple as just sort of that cartoony K-shape, isn't it bad? But there's real effects. Maybe Lyndon can jump in.
Yeah, Lyndon, Julian sounds a bit agnostic. What's your position on the K-shaped recovery?
Well, I mean, I guess part of it is that in my setting, so I work primarily now as a church minister in a very poor part of Auckland amongst poor parishioners. And I think when you say it exacerbates existing effects, that is true to some degree, particularly for the wealthy, it exacerbates the growth in wealth. But I think one of the differences between a financial crisis, where at a simplistic level, leverage around assets led to the thing. This is a very different kind of economic shock. And what it means is that some of the effects are highly unpredictable. The breakdown of the negative impacts is very different. So it affects different slices and parcels of society. What that means is that the mechanisms that we've built up over the last few decades, which are relatively good at mitigating other kinds of crises, such as a financial crisis, those mechanisms are not well aligned with the people who have been harmed the most at the moment. And at the same time, there's enormous difficulty in even acknowledging how those breakdowns have happened. So, for example, the Prime Minister was very happy to point out that unemployment has fallen. But actually, Maori and Pacific Island unemployment has gone up substantially and is now close to 10%. It's quite a bit more than 10% in some areas. And so you're starting to see these things which are very politically difficult to acknowledge. For example, effects on housing. It's great if you're a homeowner. It's pretty bad news if you're a marginal renter. And if you have housing tenure insecurity. It's been very good for motel owners as part of the tour. Again, we say tourism. Motel owners are now heavily occupied as emergency housing. But it's not great for the people who are housed in there. And there's no political will to change the housing supply picture. So I actually feel that we're in a very, very risky situation because the policy responses that would be ideal are politically unattractive at the moment. Actually, even acknowledging the particular things that affect my people, that acknowledgement is very hard for the government to give at the moment. In fact, it's across the whole there's no political party at the moment that wants to acknowledge what is happening, and there is no political party at the moment that is really committed to, from my point of view, the things that would help my iwi, that would help my parishioners. And so I feel pretty depressed at the moment when I look at the policy landscape.
So could I jump in and just ask, give us 2 examples of things that you think might help, just practical.
Well, personally, so this will get me in trouble with some people in the Māori wood, but I'd love it if we just ditched the RMA straight away and can expand housing supply substantially. Particularly if that was aligned with the ability for Māori land to be securitised in some sensible way, which is impossible at the moment, so we can't actually build on most of the Māori land that exists. And again, if there were ways to encourage the kinds of employment that align well for Māori, and I don't want to get into all the details of it, but I think those, and again, actually, I'm
a strong believer in active labour market policy, and so what I mean there is the government actively becoming involved in the labour market through education, skills, retraining, and I just don't. So I published a paper recently on migration, for example, and highlighted just our huge over-reliance on temporary visas. I'm very pro-migration, very, very pro-immigration. I don't like the style of migration that we had that was temporary. You've done your service, now you can leave now. And I think we could devise something that says, what's the pipeline of skills we need for our infrastructure spend? Now let's upskill New Zealanders to fill those roles, because we know there's going to be 10, 15, 20 years of work building this infrastructure that we need. So it's costly. It's going to be costly, and it's not going to be a quick fix.
We heard about a rise in inequality, and this is the section where we're discussing how these debt-based responses, these fiscal responses to the COVID pandemic, are reshaping society. Given that inequality, is exacerbating, what policy might be on the horizon? Julian? Easy one to... Well, we could actually separate that in that what do you see on the horizon and what do you think is necessary?
I see a whole lot more uncertainty on the horizon. I think that the current government has been focused on getting us this far. I do not think that there is a solid plan for the next 12 months or 2 years. So my own view is that they've been so focused on the crisis that they don't have a solid plan going forward. So I think you will see some... you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So I do think that there will be policy pressure in the next year. You already see a lot of policy pressure around benefits, and the government has been very reluctant to move on core benefit rates. So I think you'll see more pressure and more pressure on that. I think that the government's support is... There's certain sections of support inside the Labour government which will be saying we want to see some wins on the board for our members. And so I think you will see collective bargaining, multi-employer contracts starting to come in. You'll see this tripartite forum, some of their findings starting to roll out.
For those who don't know, what's the
tripartite forum is business and unions and the government working together to solve policy issues. And so they have been meeting. A tripartite forum has been moving forward for a long time, last year and a half. So I think you will see pressure. It's a lot of labour market pressure, I think, coming on. So you've seen this already. You've seen wages increasing. You've seen minimum wages increasing. I think we've seen the spike of those pushes, but I think there'll be follow-on effects. I think another thing we will see is just supply chains groaning the world over.
They're already groaning.
They are. You can't buy an Xbox in this country. It's really sad. Much to my wife's absolute enjoyment, you can't buy an Xbox in this country. So yeah,
Sorry,
I think...
Julian, I don't think anyone will come to your pity party.
They should. They should.
Thankfully, you can get a PS5 though.
Oh, no, you can't. Just trust me. So there's lots of... I think actually there's lots of issues, and I think you see that with a lot of the reports that are coming out of the Reserve Bank and the government at the moment. The OCR stayed at 0.25, simply because of risk, I think, that it's so hard to predict what's going to happen. The government is, I think, being prudent. It's holding some of its money back. It's holding some of its policy choices back, simply because it doesn't know the future. And it's saying this crisis has been so unpredictable, we need some gunpowder left behind. And I kind of applaud that. I applaud a sense of prudence, simply because it's so hard to predict. I don't know if I answered your question, but maybe Lyndon can jump in.
Well, actually, I'm interested in, you're talking about unpredictability. You're talking about uncertainty over whether governments can act. And I know that in conversations we've had before this, Lyndon, you've been looking into how pandemics reshape societies. And these are other measures in how our society is being reshaped. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Well, I think one of the things... obviously pandemics don't happen super frequently, especially not global ones. And so it's a little bit hard sometimes to draw conclusions from what has happened in the past. But there does seem to be some degree in which the way in which the social disruption plays out actually has an interaction with the purely mathematical economics of repaying debt and so forth. And it's particularly what you've seen happening where people who are asset holders becoming significantly more wealthy, that tends to have bad social outcomes in the long run, mainly because the larger number of people who didn't get wealthy and are feeling a bit stink about that, sometimes this boils over. Now, it doesn't always end up in guillotines.
I've got a really good quote. Keep going.
No, go for it. You can't leave them hanging now.
Minister of Finance, 1920s, Russian Minister of Finance, said inflation is the machine gun of the proletariat that will mow down the moneyed classes.
There we go.
So there you go.
Yeah, well, inflation is actually, if you're indebted, inflation of the right sort can be extremely helpful. But I think the uncertainty, the risk that this produces, the kind of social upheaval that actually produces a real breakdown is something that ought to be considered quite seriously. And unlike my friend Julian, I wish the government were actually a bit less prudent, because we're sitting in an enormously... we've got a lot of gunpowder, and I kind of feel like we're facing a situation where we could actually use some of that gunpowder. And maybe the illustration is helpful because, the gunpowder gets put to use at other uses in the long run when you don't put it to a happy use to get some fires started in the meantime. So, I mean, you look at policy responses that could happen, things that do seem to have some degree of benefit. What's happening in the US with stimulus checks going directly to people. Obviously, this encourages consumption. There are negative effects to that if that goes too far. I mean, you can do other things in a fiscal expansion. There's that guy, was it Azerbaijan or I forget which one, the dictator spent a really large amount of money building an enormous statue of himself. Now, that is infrastructure of a kind, I guess, but I'm not sure it has the knock-on social effects that you'd really be looking for. So, I mean, the government's announced infrastructure spending. It's actually only 1.8 billion of significant spending. To me, that's a drop in the bucket. We actually have, by and large, a pretty socialist government. For once, despite the fact I'm pretty right-wing, I'd really like them to pretend to be socialist for a bit. Just have some appetite for this would be my thing.
I mean, I would say they're probably fairly conservative, actually. And
yeah, they are.
And which is interesting because that's not always a bad thing. But
I know, in general, it's a really good thing, by the way.
For me, a big thing is education. I think what we are going to see is a huge amount of education scarring. There are swathes of New Zealand children who have been struggling through the education system because of the crisis. And their education outcomes are likely to be negatively affected. So one thing we should be doing right now, I think, is investing in that infrastructure in some way, shape or form. I do not have a direct policy, I mean, it's just not my field of expertise, but I do know that we just need to start doing that. I think there is an opportunity here to start pivoting towards some environmental solutions if we're going to choose areas to get into. But I mean, one of my big things is we need to invest in people as much as bridges. Yeah, I'm not such a huge fan of the helicopter money, giving everybody $1,500 US or whatever.
Don't they just buy a bunch of TVs or something like that?
Oh, it depends. I mean, you can design it in better ways. You can give people vouchers, which they have to spend. You can't go to your bank and say, "Here's my voucher to put it off my mortgage." So there's ways of designing things that are better, but. Yeah, I mean, we've got huge infrastructure problems, right? When we've had them for a while. We've had hospitals that are creaking and groaning. We've had a range of things which actually, even Treasury before the crisis was saying, why 30? I think we could go to 40 and we'd be fine. Sort of developed countries, the average debt loading for core crown grid, I think, is 98%, and we're sitting at 30. So I think there is some headroom here. But also, let's just not run around like chickens as well. Let's think about this deeply before we do it.
In terms of the worst case scenario, crashes, what do historical precedents tell us about crashes?
They're bad. Yeah, I mean, we've put maybe there's that graph. I did that graph earlier. That's kind of fun. I don't know if that can come up. So, I mean, this is GDP in New Zealand going back to what? 1960, you can see the good years, right? The good years are actually, and what we see is we actually see a series of shocks, and I think what you can see over time is that these shocks are becoming steeper and more pronounced, and I think this is to do with leverage, with global markets, that we're now way more interconnected. We haven't got the latest one on there, the data's not available publicly for me to just grab, but if it does happen, it's gonna be big and it's gonna be nasty. And it hasn't happened yet. Like, in some respects, all of what we've been talking about is simply because people decided to be creative. Two years ago, if you had said to a Reserve Bank official, we're going to spend $100 billion buying bonds in 2 years' time, they would look at you like you're a loon. Yeah? So all of this is emergent policy, and all of it is like trying something new without fully knowing the consequences.
Well, and I was thinking this comes back as well to where you were starting, which is while public sector debt in this country is not in a problematic level, private sector debt here is catastrophically risky. And these kind of shocks have a very, very unfortunate outcome. And so, say in Māngere, where I have my day-to-day work, the only nice shops in the Māngere shopping centre are payday lenders. Now, a lot of that private indebtedness is not a little bit of extra money on the mortgage, because you wanted to buy a boat, even though that's actually not great lending to do either. There's a pretty strong argument that a lot of the mortgage debt, even just to own a house, is not particularly great. There's bad outcomes typically around this, as we saw in the GFC, around what happens if that starts to be called in, because unlike the government, I don't have the ability to refuse the bank when they want the money repaid. Interest rates go up at the same time, and the thing can really spiral down badly. But the people who are most affected in that are those who have taken out loans. In South Auckland, it's particularly to pay for funerals and so forth, and that level of indebtedness is an extremely significant risk for the country. And again, it plays back into all those other factors that we talked about.
So, I looked at the numbers. New Zealand's private debt is 175% of GDP. Yeah, how does that compare to the government's 30%? It's just massively different, right? And so if you take out financial institutions and it's just purely household debt, it's at 94% of GDP. So actually, there's an order of magnitude here where households are exposed. And so one way of thinking about debt overall is it just has to, debt exists. Your envelope of debt exists. If you've got this part of it as government and that's low, you are likely to balloon out on the private side. And so there is this debate to be had around the debt envelope saying, well, what's a good social risk here and what's a good private risk? And what we've seen is the government being incredibly fiscally responsible to a point where you could argue it's placing some of the burden on private households. And you see that in some of these communities where to pay for funerals, they're having to go to private loans. And that's not a great place for our society to be. And so there are some big questions there around the total debt envelope and where that is placed.
Given the size of private debt in New Zealand, what should we do? Should we try and get that down? Is there some strategy? I'm thinking personally, and I'm going to frame this provocatively, but should I buy another house? Should I buy a Banksy? Should I buy gold? What's the response?
Who are you interested in helping? Yourself? Or are you interested in helping a community or a family? So there's different responses, right, depending on where you frame and locate yourself in New Zealand today. If you're interested just in you, I would say go buy some gold. It doesn't rust. Moths don't eat it. When everything goes to absolute rubbish, you've got some gold, right? It was before the pandemic hit. It was December last year? No, I sent out a thing at work saying, I'm feeling a bit dodgy about the world economy. Maybe if you've got assets, go buy some gold. But that doesn't serve communities. That doesn't serve people. Lyndon.
So to serve communities, what do we do?
Well, as individuals, there's a lot of these come back to systemic problems, though, and I don't think there's a huge amount that, as individuals, we can do with our financial choices that make a big difference. I do think buying gold is a particularly socially unproductive thing to do. And actually, when you look back over the price history, it often doesn't actually work out particularly well. So there are other assets you could do. Now, I need to be very careful not to stray into FMA-regulated territory and start giving financial advice.
This is a discussion in the pub.
I'm deeply tempted to.
It's not a financial advice session.
Yes, that's right. So there are asset classes which will remain unnamed, which would be very interesting to get involved in at a personal level. But I think actually there's something here more about how do we function collectively, and especially those of us who have influence or who can work together, who can speak into the policy space, which is why I'm so thankful for Maxim and its voice into that space, to say actually this is a point where real courage is needed in the policy side of things, is to look at things and not go back to the playbook that has served so well in many ways for a long period. You look at the chart before, actually there's a lot of growth there, some nasty shocks, but it was a big time of growth. But I think that playbook might no longer be as useful as it was, because the changes that have kicked in because of COVID-19 have shifted things in very significant ways. And so I think there's much more here about how do we function as a society to choose collectively around policy responses. Now, some of our larger institutions, some of our wealthier people and individuals, they do have the firepower to make an impact in particular ways. And so, for example, being the agent for an increase in housing supply, or I've seen you mentioned the education side of it. Over in Point England, Glennis, I grew up in Panmure and have never had any desire to go back there. But what I saw was, it's a bit of a hole. And there's a school principal there, Russell Burt, who established the first school cluster, Manaiakalani. What they did was they installed infrastructure around Glen Innes and Point England so that there was Wi-Fi that was only usable by the school children, raised private funding, which meant that every child in those schools has a device at home. Now you compare that to most schools in South Auckland, where even if you have a device, you've got no internet access. And so this whole idea that you were doing school during the lockdowns was a complete nonsense. And that then played out subsequently because a bunch of people had had their jobs deleted. There was one secondary school principal in South Auckland, I won't say which one it was, 40% of his role did not come back after the first lockdown. All right? So what happened then, can you think of it, 40%, okay? Now, those kinds of things are not going to play out well over the next few years. Those kids are not going to magically get better. There's no tutor coming to their rescue. So these infrastructure issues, we're not talking here about a bridge or a road, but it's still infrastructure that means that the poorest children are the ones who have been harmed the most during this. Now, I know there is, I deal with the complex social situations, but it's not the kids who decided to be in those situations. And so I think there's something here around trying to engage well around those. And what struck me in Glen Innes, Point England, was this was a combination of some policy stuff, but also individuals, largely some wealthy individuals doing something. And it's sort of caught on, but it hasn't really spread. So it's only an example, but there's an interplay here that can happen.
Okay, and just as a side note, Maxim Institute will be looking into predatory lending and the history of predatory lending in New Zealand. There have been some initiatives from the current government. We want to see just whether they're effective, and we have a new researcher, Ala Joe, but this is something that we are on top of. Thank you. Okay, first question of the evening from the floor. Is the government printing money going to result in a massive transfer of wealth by stealth? Lyndon.
Well, the answer is it depends a little bit on exactly what happens with it. It could do, and in fact that might be seen as one possible desirable outcome for printing money. So rather than, for example, the French Revolution obviously took a lot of wealth off some people and gave it to others, but it wasn't a particularly fun process for the people who lost the wealth. Money printing as a way of transferring wealth from those who are asset holders to those who are indebted can be a more palatable version of achieving some kinds of the same outcomes. But there are other ways, there are a whole bunch of different ways. Printing money means a bunch of different things, and it very much depends what you do with the money that you've printed.
Yes, I don't think it's so stealthy, to be honest. People with wealth at the moment have probably seen their assets increase, and that's intentional. It's sort of better the house price inflation that you know than the crash you don't. It's that policy of least regrets that the Reserve Bank and Treasury are basically operating on, is we'll do it because we'll regret not doing it probably more. And it's not necessarily the best policy way of doing it. I just don't think it's that stealthy.
It's not at all. No. And there are other ways of looking at the whole challenge as well, which would be thinking about the voluntary aspect of it. I just don't think it's the defining feature of what's going on with monetary policy.
You mentioned earlier, Julian, the political unwillingness to make useful policy. Do you have ideas of what could encourage the government to do so, or different ways of making policy, such as citizens' assemblies? How might we encourage the government to make useful policy? Imagine you're the Prime Minister.
I'm a little bit biased here.
While Julian gets his courage up, I'd say one thing that really tends to provoke governments to act is fear of being voted out. So I would say a credible opposition is a really important step. And I'm sorry if there's anyone who's too deeply involved in the National Party, but that would actually be one really great help.
Honestly, if you get called up on the phone in a focus group, be brutally honest, because I think there's a lot of focus groups going on trying to work out whether or not the next election can be won. And which is really sad in some respects. This is a majority government in a MMP situation. This doesn't happen very often, right? The situation we're in right now doesn't happen very often. And in some respects, there is a fear of losing the next election. I mean, I like prudence. Make noise. Make lots of noise if you think you've got a good idea.
What do you think is the we call it timidity perhaps is in government? Is it just based on a political fear of losing? Because if there's not a credible opposition,
There's part of that,
there's
but
an unlikely
You
chance.
also, I mean, and maybe I'll speak off the cuff here and I'll get told off later, who knows. I mean, you saw a party in the 80s, the Labour Party in the 80s, that made quite radical reform, very radical reform. And there were a whole lot of unintended consequences from those reforms that they weren't really cognizant of. So I think there is a deep-seated understanding now within the party that change can make things worse off. If you do make things worse off, you end up getting voted out, and then the opposition party can do whatever they want. And so I think there is a bit of history that comes into this, and there's some wisdom to that actually. That radical policy change often has unintended consequences. Balancing that though is how do we treat the most vulnerable in New Zealand today? And so there's always this balancing that's going on between who do we want to help and what's the best way. And I think at the moment the balance is leaning towards stability and not so much on who are the most vulnerable that we want to help. And so, yeah.
See, I think this has got less to do with a particular political culture, and I think it's got something more to do, in my view, and I'm going to annoy probably most of you in the room by saying this, okay? And it's because one of the things I loved about working in the UK was the meritocracy of ideas, the entrepreneurial place it was, the fact that you could actually get stuff done there. And coming back to New Zealand is this crippling sense that we do not like entrepreneurial thought. We're just not willing to think about change in the same way as English people are. And what's weird is that's not the narrative that we tell ourselves as Kiwis. But I've lived in both worlds, and I'm telling you, that is a big, big difference here. And
it's interesting because I would say the public service was incredibly nimble. And when you look at around the world, $1.9 trillion in the US, but it's only coming out now. Sure. Like in New Zealand, we had COVID income relief payment, we had wage subsidies all within weeks, which is incredibly quick, right? For the public service, they were practically dancing around like fairy. I mean, it was amazing.
You could apply online and you could
do this stuff. Yeah. Yep. So,
but you're talking about
I'm talking about systemic stuff, though.
Right. Private entrepreneurial culture doesn't really exist?
I mean, it does in the sense that individual entrepreneurs are all around the place, right? But this sort of systemic entrepreneurialism about a real reform, and I think this is where people have gone, Labour's good in a crisis, but they're not good at change. Well, I actually think it's a slightly deeper thing, which is that some of the structural changes we find very hard to enact.
It's also, so in reflecting on what you're saying, I would also argue that there's a fear of opening up policy to entrepreneurs.
Yes.
And and I've spoken publicly about this in another forum. I mean, I think the way the government acted in the first week of the pandemic, fantastic. But we're a year in now. There's a whole lot of people out there who've got amazing ideas, who do this for a living, and they could be speaking into these policy areas. And that's the bit that I'm sort of like, you know what, actually the time has come to open up the doors to entrepreneurs more and more. Like listen, engage in the policy issues. They've got brilliant ideas. The public service doesn't have the monopoly on good ideas.
Yeah, and I think we see this particularly if you say Maori are overrepresented in the needs side of things, then the fact that in the first week of stimulus, more fiscal expansion happened than through the entire treaty claims process. It's not even necessarily entrepreneurial in one sense, but you could simply commit a bit more to Maori to come up with solutions within that world. And that would be something that I think would be politically quite attractive in many ways. But it still frustrates me a bit that those ideas and many, many others can't gain enough currency in our setting. There's just a risk aversion there for me.
So how do we change the risk aversion? We're in a time of massive risks, possibly unprecedented a lack of social cohesion. The risks are higher than they've ever been. What do we do to pull the lever to change that culture?
I honestly feel like I don't have much idea. I mean, I'd quite like to, even though I have no particular background in it, I'd love to take over, running a big policy area for the government. But I'd say the chances of that are extremely low, and possibly might lead to some of the unforeseen consequences that my friend was talking about. So it might not even be a good idea.
It's interesting because I'm based in Wellington. I hang out in policy environments. I go to soccer at the weekend, and there's an MB official and a Treasury official and a something else official, and the public conversation is actually really important. So you do hear back through the policy loops. Often, for example, with the work we do, we'll go into an environment, we'll make a case for something. The politician is like, no. The officials are like, keep talking, please. Pressure needs to come from the public service. It needs to come from our social institutions. If you're involved in a social institution, a bowling club, make some noise. Get into the public debate. Yeah, write a letter to your editor. Don't go completely crazy maybe, but get actually involved in the public debate on these things, because I think as pressure is applied from multiple angles, the focus groups start to change. And so I'd say make some noise.
All right, we're coming to the end of this, and I would like to ask you to sort of summarise it. If all of this that we've been describing, and we're talking about a whole lot of bad news that possibly might produce some good news, I want you to think about what that goodness might look like. So given that we say, well, we don't waste a crisis, if the crisis goes unwasted, paint a picture of what a better New Zealand might look like at the other end of this.
Oh, well, I mean, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to speak here as a church minister and somebody who's also got a real interest in the theological approach to some of this. And in the Christian tradition, debt is, and this comes from some of the scriptural reflection on this, debt is typically seen as something which creates a divided allegiance for you. And so in the Christian tradition, your allegiance should be directed towards God. And even in a secular setting, we can see that play out. So there are power dynamics that arise from people being overly indebted that constrain and cripple their choices, that direct them down pathways that can be deeply damaging. And so for me, one of the things I'd love to see happen is for people to be freed up from that sense of being placed under compulsion, of having their choices and their economic freedom and their social freedom so deeply constrained by the fact that their allegiance has now been tied into somebody, often as a very socially harmful setting from my point of view. And so I've tried to be open there that this is informed by my beliefs as a Christian and as somebody who wants to one day become a theologian around this. But actually I think you can see it in a secular setting, that once your loyalty in your life is tied into a payday lender, for example, or even in the middle class setting, when so much of our energy is tied into how much can I borrow against the house, and all my mind is directed towards that, or how can I leverage up around assets and so forth, it actually changes the way that we think about society, our interactions. It controls us to a particular way. So I would actually love to see a shift to some degree at least away from private sector debt. But I'm trying to be open and say that's actually, you might not agree with my presuppositions on that.
Mm. And I do think that there is something long term here that we need to think about when it comes to that 30%. And what might we productively invest in for the future of New Zealand?
This is the 30% government debt.
Yeah. That actually, sometimes was it amazing that we had low debt? Should we be praising previous governments for enabling us to be in the position that we're in? Yes, but also right now with really low interest rates, now is the time to invest. I would say let's look at our hospital infrastructure. Let's look at some of the bottlenecks that we have. Let's really look a really close look at education policy. Because we can, and this is the thing, I don't know if you ever look at government policy papers, but every single one of them says build back better, the triple B, and actually I don't think they're going to. I think it's rhetoric. I think it's a lot of how can we comms this really well, I actually think we need to start thinking about how do we build back better. And that might mean slightly higher taxes. That might mean that I say, you know what, I'm prepared to pay 3% more if it will enable a whole range of things in the social environment. So there is a rebalancing and a thinking through of individual responsibility and that collective responsibility.
Okay, a rebalancing and perhaps a reevaluation of our relationship to material goods and material desires. And also, I would say a challenge to all of us here and you in the audience about engagement in the political process and the desire to agitate for change that is better, change that you believe will improve our country, change that will improve the lot of those who are probably suffering the most from this situation. On that challenge, on that note, I'd like to end things. Could you please put your hands together for Lyndon and Julian?
Now, if you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. That's www.maxim.org.nz. Thanks again for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā. Goodbye for now.